So I have the great pleasure in welcoming Carolyn Mason-Parker and Peter Muir from KIS International School in Bangkok. Carolyn is the head of school and Peter is the Director of Learning, Analytics and Innovation. My name is Richard Andrew from Learn, Implement, Share. The topic is the use of data for intuition-based teaching progression. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So Carolyn and I touched on this topic during our last recorded conversation, and I wanted to explore this a little bit further. So to unpack the topic a little bit, so clearly data-informed practice is essential in education circles, and we need to know that what we're doing in classrooms is working. However, my sense is that when terms like research-backed practice are used, the inference is for schools and teachers to adopt approaches that are overwhelmingly backed by research. In other words, the research happens first and the implementations are in response to that research, which is fine, but I have some questions about this. Is it valid for experienced teachers to follow their intuition when teaching? In other words, is it valid for them to follow common sense in the classroom? In other words, should we encourage teachers to read the room while they're teaching and then respond to that accordingly? And if it is valid, if it's valid to encourage teachers to follow their professional instincts, what role does data play? That's the question I asked Carolyn last time, and you said, yeah, it's no problem, you just do this, this, and this. And that's what I want to unpack a bit further. So how does a teacher collect such data, and is it valid to do that? Because I see high quality teaching as doing exactly that, following one's professional instincts, pivoting in mid-flight where necessary to make something work that's not quite working, or to drop an approach altogether and try it again a few days later after some serious rethinking. So I posed these sorts of questions to Carolyn prior to this chat, and Carolyn provided me with some notes and a rubric, which we'll refer to in a minute, and I'll get Carolyn and Peter to expand on those. So what I'm aiming for here is that we might provide some simple guidelines for teachers to follow, including those teachers who have never really thought about this process of following one's intuition and collecting data as you go, and what that might look like. So before we get into the weeds, Carolyn, Peter, do you have anything you want to say before we dive into that?
Yeah, Peter and I were just talking this morning, and I will let him have a go in a minute too, about this in terms of reactive teaching and what it looks like in the classroom and how teachers do make those switches. They know their kids, they're collecting that formative data all the time. And it might not look like written data. It's not necessarily going to be the kind that you get in a spreadsheet that you can look at and crunch numbers. It's much more of that data about knowing the children. How much eye contact are you getting from a kid? How much are they looking at you and engaging in the process? How much are they chatting to their friends about relevant things that are happening in the classroom? And just kind of keeping a tally of that.
Fantastic. The only thing I wanted to say was, I think, and I was one of them, I think a lot of teachers assume that what you said there isn't considered data, right? I think a lot of people think it is spreadsheet stuff and numbers on a page and so on. So I find that encouraging, that it's reading the room, isn't it? And really getting that sense of what's going on, which is basically what I did most of my career, but thinking that I was wrong doing it because I'm not collecting data, Anyway.
So sorry, I've jumped in. You're unknowingly collecting data.
Yeah.
You're sort of I think a good educator is quite conscious of what is going on, as in your words, reading the room, but acknowledging the involvement of students and seeing how what they've designed is having an impact on them, listening to the conversations, listening to the questions, asking questions themselves. That's sort of, in a way, all of that is collecting data.
Now, this might be spoken about and written about in IB circles, but I don't think it is outside of IB circles. I've never seen this articulated, like this idea of following your intuition. It's all got to have research-backed data. And again, my inference is that I think people assume it's like, let's buy the book and see what they say, see what the experts say. Oh, okay, we'll implement that. I never hear about this going with the flow, more than going with the flow, but like reading the room and adjusting on the fly and getting that other kind of data as feedback. So I think that's exciting.
Right. I think it's really relevant to say, look at how the students are engaging, look at what they're doing. I was in a grade 3 classroom 2 days ago, and they were working on writing stories. They were looking at character and setting and how that impacts what goes on in the story. But to just sit with the group. You could hear them playing with language. They were translanguaging, flipping between Thai and English for their group, playing with the words that they might use and how that would impact how you saw the character, thinking about what different names they could give and the different name that impacted the character. So you could tell straight away that group completely understood what they needed to do. They had a really good concept of how character and setting were going to impact the narrative, and they could run with it. And then there was another group that were working through it, but were very much more methodical and were having those conversations, and a little bit of teacher guidance in there gave them that confidence to take the next step. They were able to say, let's stop this for a second, let's reframe how this question works. And then that group ran with it in the same way. And you could hear them with so if we want it to be scary, we go with dark and rainy. And it was that all from the teacher re-questioning and reframing the activity. So that's absolutely collecting data and comparing how the kids are reacting and how they're looking differently at the task.
But when you say collecting data, they're not going around the room with a piece of paper and going, Charles did this and right. So that's clear. So you're not collecting data in that sense, but you are reading the room and you're responding to you can just see that that's not working. And what can I do? I'll ask the questions. The questions.
And I think you can see the difference between a less experienced teacher and one that's more experienced. Is it that sort of reading the room? We keep using that language, but that sort of comes naturally to them because of their experiences. They understand what to look for and they understand how to respond to that. Perhaps less experienced teachers are not reading the room. They'll design their lesson, they'll start implementing, and the kids are learning, but they might not be able to pick up on that group and see that they're not sort of responding. They might not be responsive and change and support, ask those, what Carolyn said, those guiding questions to sort of support them in deeper understanding.
So here's a question that's not on the script. Is it possible to help inexperienced teachers learn how to do this faster than they would if they were left on their own? And I'm thinking about myself because I had no one helping me, so it took a long time to kind of change. But if I had someone say, "Oh, look, Richard, like look what's going on," then I would have lapped it up.
That's the power of the mentor, and I think a lot of people are saying now that incoming teachers, new people to the industry, that they need an experienced mentor to be able to guide them in that way and to be able to coach them in understanding the little nuances like collecting data, even though you don't have a clipboard.
Right.
The opportunity to get in and see other people teaching, but maybe have those more experienced teachers do peer observations in your classroom too, where you can have that debrief session at the end and they can give you the prompting questions. Well, tell me how you think it went, what was going on here. Did you see what was happening with, how would you address this? And have that professional dialogue on a peer-to-peer level.
Yeah.
Right.
And talking about the real experiences of school, I've actually got to run because I'm about to present. I have to go set up a room and get slides up and all. So I'm sorry, I've got to leave the conversation.
Thanks for the look. We should do this again sometime. So thanks for your input.
Cheers. See you later.
See ya. So Carolyn sent me a couple of examples, and one is about a grade 2 unit. And so I'll just get Carolyn, rather than me reading it through, I'll get Carolyn to sort of read and unpack that as like set the scene, and then I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, so a few weeks ago, I was in a grade 2 classroom and they were doing a unit on how communities meet their needs. The teacher was working with students and she noticed that students were sharing personal family stories, but they weren't connecting those stories to broader ideas around community systems. So their language reflected personal anecdotes, but they were lacking that broader application.
Right.
So this informal observation revealed a conceptual understanding gap in terms of what the teacher was looking for the students to understand. So the teacher shifted gears, she stopped what they were doing, and she moved into a role play activity instead, where the children could simulate community services. So instead of asking them to think just in that conceptual way and to narrate things, she was giving them that practical opportunity, a hands-on way to explore roles, to show the interdependence between what she was asking them to do, and showing how they could make that shift from kind of group talking and group research to experiential learning.
You saw this in action?
Yes, she was great. The teacher is fabulous.
Can you give me one example of a role play that some kids did? Like, can you remember?
Yeah, so they were sharing family stories,
Yeah.
but not connecting those to how community systems can work. So we were thinking more about what systems do we have in the community to support us? What would happen if we wanted to make an emergency call? And how does the community respond to that?
Yep.
So we could then stop, instead of having those conversations about, oh, I saw an emergency when, we stop, we reset. Okay, let's role play an emergency. What's going to happen if you need to make a call? Who are you going to call? Let's pretend we're going to pick up the phone. What are you going to say? Who is answering the phone on the other end? So then they had questions to guide what that would look like for students. They could really start to imagine what those systems were. And that then led into a bigger picture conversation about who is there to help us, who supports our communities, what does this look like?
So the important thing there is that the teacher was, by questioning, was guiding the role play so as the kids can make the connection.
Yeah.
Right. But the important thing here is that the teacher recognized that what the students were doing they weren't getting the point of the exercise. And so made a shift, thought, do a role play. But really it's a role play that allowed the teacher to ask a whole lot of questions. Like, who would you call? How would that work? What would it look like, etc.
Yes.
Right.
So moving away from just that, oh, I thought you had an understanding around the systems, but you're talking about something personal that happened just with you in your household, and not connecting that to the bigger picture, wider community. So that's not working as an activity where we're asking you to share stories. So let's stop, reframe, and shift the thinking slightly.
Right. So I'm going to put on the screen a rubric, and Carolyn's going to talk about the transfer of knowledge row and how that might relate for the teacher in that situation that we just talked about.
If we look at the transfer of knowledge row, you will see that when a student is only talking about their personal experiences, talking about something that happened to them and connecting that to something that is just personal for them, like something that happened in their house, that would be putting them in the emerging column, because they're only connecting to the personal.
Right.
What we want to see is students being able to move through that till they're at developing, proficient, and extending. So by stopping, or by understanding where that student was that was talking about their personal, stopping, reframing, and being able to guide with questions, it enabled the student to move through that rubric. So they were then able to start thinking about emergencies and make their comparisons between what happened in a personal to a community system. And the teacher can do that with prompting. So they're then in the developing section of the rubric with questions coming in. They're able to answer that with the teacher and show them where they are. To move further through and then move into the proficient area of the rubric, that then asks the student to take their personal experience and connect it into the community system. So they now have a better understanding of what the concept of a community system is, and they can start to shift their personal into the community. And they've done that through role play rather than just retelling a story. And then as they move through, and I will say I didn't stay for the whole lesson, so I don't know if they got there, they move into the extending, and then they can start to bring in new experiences or say, oh, okay, now I can understand how my experience connected to community. I can bring in another story that happened to me, maybe, but I can share how that straight away was in a community system. Or I can tell a story about how my friend had something happen to them and it's a community system.
Fantastic. So at grade 2, the kids aren't looking at this rubric. This is for the teacher. And so this would help a teacher to have more revelation about, oh, okay, this is what we're looking for here. So is that the point of the rubric, or does the teacher then log something after the lesson using the rubric?
Yeah, that would depend very much on the teacher and where they're at in terms of their planning cycle. I know our teachers, I think most IB teachers do a lot of collaborative planning. They sit down, they talk about what their intended outcomes are for students. So in a team, they've already discussed where they want students to be, where they expect them to be. They make notes, they make reflections on the end of every single class. So they've got that documentation for where it's going next, and they know where to help students with their learning.
But I can see, especially for a semi-experienced teacher, when they unpack something like this, it really would open up the doorway into, okay, wow, this has given me a lot more intel about what I'm on about here, what I'm aiming to achieve.
Yeah, so when we do things with brand new trainee teachers who are just coming in and working on their NQT programs, QTS programs, PGCE programs, training teachers, The first time we do the planning with them, we ask them to sit down, they plan one activity. So they're not thinking about the whole lesson, they're just thinking about that very small piece of the activity. And when we do that, we ask them to think about one group with maybe 4 students and have a rubric like this developed. So for that very initial beginning, with the very first time in class, they would have that and they would be able to go through and highlight that and see that progression and have that reflection. When you're more experienced teachers, and like I said, we talk about our collaborative planning, they will jot down notes, make notes about students very briefly, and it won't necessarily look the same in terms of how they carry that forward, because they're coming with the experience of knowing those children and knowing where their progression is and what that looks like and feels like for them.
Fantastic. We've got one more example, which is a middle years program example. We don't have a rubric specifically for this. So Carolyn, if you want to unpack this scenario and just talk about how the teacher, what the teacher did to pivot.
Yeah, absolutely. So shifting into MYP, because it looks a little bit different when you're in MYP to PYP, but it follows the same format in that teachers would still have a rubric or an understanding of what a rubric and working through that process would look like for students. So grade 9 English Lang and Lit class was focused on identity and literature. The teacher had picked up on the fact that students were summarizing plot points, but they were avoiding deeper analysis and looking at character motivations. They were referring to character actions, but avoiding how they could describe it. Was there internal conflict? Why did something happen? So they could give the what, but not the why. So seeing this, the teacher managed to kind of pivot and change and brought in a different short text. It had an internal dialogue, and they ran a mini workshop on how you could annotate character thought processes. So moving from the physical what happened into the critical thinking and literary analysis that gave them the opportunity to be the character and see why they would be thinking in different ways. So they kind of taught a mini lesson really on inference and interpretation skills, but paused the main framework in order to teach that and give the students the skills they needed to do that piece.
And so in that example, the teacher or the group of teachers who are working on this would have already developed a rubric specifically for this kind of activity.
Absolutely.
I guess you could have a rubric that could be used for a genre of activities. And at year 9 level, I guess the students probably are looking at that rubric, are they?
Absolutely. So students have access to the rubrics. Every task that our teachers work on, we have a task-specific rubric for.
But not at grade 2, though.
Grade 2, yes, the kids just don't have access to it in the same way.
At what grade level would they be starting to look at rubrics?
They are aware of rubrics all the way through. So even if you ask our EY students, they will be able to talk to you about the fact that it's sliding scale. They will know how things progress. They don't physically have a copy of it on their desk in front of them in the same way that grade 9 would. Grade 9 have access to it. It's there. They can go through and check. We will use it when we're speaking to them, when we're talking with them about assessment. We will say, what does the rubric say? Have you looked at this? Have you? They are absolutely au fait with it by grade 9. But it's a sliding scale again, that work in progress. They start right from our youngest students that hear the language and build up until they are at the point where it's developmentally appropriate. And that doesn't always happen at exactly the same point for every single student. So it's working with what is good for them as well. And then looking at how you can share that with them in different ways as they get older too. So when we first start sharing, we'll go through and it will just be, we'll give them a statement. And it will be, can you give us a smiley face, a straight face, or a sad face about how you're feeling on this statement and how you feel your learning has gone? Can you do thumbs up, thumbs down on a statement that we've given you about your learning and where on this rubric you'd be? As they get older, you can move along to 1, 2, 3. Yep. Then you get into the, I know, I wonder, I saw, I understand. You can work through the processes with all the different language around it.
The key point you said is that the rubrics are designed for a particular topic, and they'd be designed collaboratively, usually with teachers.
Yep.
Can you just unpack this one? You said the same rubric can be used formatively to guide feedback and summatively to reflect learning at the end of a unit and distribute growth. Can you just unpack those 2 different scenarios, like without showing a rubric?
Yeah, sure. So If you take a slightly older student, just because it's easier, you can ask them to do that self-assessment point at the beginning. Give them the rubric for the task, ask them to self-assess, see where they think they are. You can use that as your formative assessment rubric as you move through. So the kids have all told you where they are, they've all told you their starting point. It may or may not be accurate, but you've got a guiding place to start with. You've got that prior assessment piece. You can watch how they work, you can look at how they're learning, you hear the conversations, you look at how they interact, you're listening, you're picking up if they do exit slips, if you're asking them to turn in notes, any activity within that you're asking, you're gathering information from all the time. So as a formative piece, when you're speaking with the students in class, you can use that rubric to frame out the conversation. And you can have, oh, I heard you doing this really well. I saw on your exit ticket yesterday that you really understood this because. So in terms of a formative setting, all the way through. And then when you do your summative task, the students have got it. They've gathered that formative feedback. They know where they've done well. They know where they may need a little bit of further guidance. They know where they can ask you questions. They know where you can help facilitate their learning. So by the time you get to the end, you've got the same rubric. It tells a journey. It's the story of that student learning. It's not just, this is your attainment. It's the whole progress that's taken place in between.
So, Carolyn, I think that's fantastic. There are two great examples of using this process and the way a rubric can be used, which is allowing teachers to pivot on the fly and giving examples of what that looks like. And then you've brought in the rubric to explain the learning process and assessment and so on. So your summary, I think, is that it's okay to follow your professional wisdom in the classroom and read the signs, and that is, and this is still kind of new to me, that is a form of data collection.
Absolutely. That is data. Knowing your students is your data, and use it to guide your lessons. Change, pivot, yep, whatever you need.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure talking to you as ever.